Hello everyone. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to the first afternoon of the conference and to our second keynote session. My name's Janet Fletcher and I'm the University Librarian at Victoria University of Wellington, and I'm chairing this session this afternoon. Not much housekeeping, except that I do hope you had an enjoyable lunch and that you spoke to our industry partners. And thank you to our partners and sponsors for their support of this conference, and a special thank you to Gale Cengage for their support as a conference platinum sponsor. And for all you tweeters, don't forget it's #InfoOnline19. So now I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Daniel Hook. You would have read in the program his bio. To put it simply, at the moment, Daniel is the CEO for Digital Science. Digital Science is a technology company with about 15 portfolio companies that sit under that name. From its website, Digital Science says it provides the solutions for researchers, researchers, institutions, funders and publishers. What it misses is it also provides solutions for librarians. So Daniel's going to change the website. I first met Daniel almost 10 years ago now. I met him in London. I didn't meet him in Australia, which may have something to do with a football match. But when I met him in London, Daniel was really busy building up his company called Symplectic, which he was a co-founder and a CEO at the time. And Symplectic was very important because it was developing the software called Elements, which many of our institutions around the world now use to manage our institutional research outputs. When I first met Daniel in that time in London, I knew that I'd met a very special person. Daniel is a well-respected scientist in theoretical physics, no less, and he still publishes quite a lot in his discipline and works with his colleagues within theoretical physics. He obviously can design great software, which we know from Elements and for things like dimensions that have now been introduced. He runs and leads a multi-million-pound company in digital science. But most importantly, he's a really deep and innovative thinker, and that's what I've really valued the most over these years. But Daniel, of course, you'd think that would be busy enough, but no. Daniel is currently starting an MBA at the University of Cambridge and already has plans for his second and his third PhD. Daniel is also a talented pianist. He speaks pretty good French, often when we're ordering sweet dessert wine. He can say the French names very nicely. And he introduced to me all those years ago to the wonderful TV show, The Big Bang Theory. And he did promise very quickly that he wasn't Sheldon. And in return, I tried to excite Daniel of the excitement of AFL football, particularly my beloved St Kilda team. Let's just say that's a work in progress. He does have the scarf though. So this afternoon, Daniel is going to talk about a possible future for scholarly communication, and I think you'll be very interested in what he has to say. So please welcome Daniel to the podium. Thank you.
Well, it's lovely to be here. Thank you, Janet, for the rousing and slightly embarrassing introduction. I guess that's what you sign up for when you come to do a keynote in Australia. So it's noted for future. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. I wanted to share with you some of the thinking that I've been doing over the last few years at Digital Science. And to kind of preface that, I wanted to give you a little bit of insight into what digital science is, because it's not a standard company, and it's not configured in a standard kind of company way. And so I think it's nice to understand that, in fact, we view ourselves a little bit like a university. Around 50% of our clients are university clients, and the best organizations mimic the people they work with. And so we kind of have a university center, which is effectively what I run. And, in that university center, we do things like strategy and thought leadership, and we spend our time thinking about how the market is developing and the types of things that the market may need. And then underneath that university centre, we have a number of departments, effectively. So each of the products in digital science we think of as a department, a university department. They have a lot of power pushed out to them, so they're quite autonomous and they're quite independent. But we facilitate collaborations within that context. And so effectively, the product that some of you may have seen most recently, Dimensions, was a collaboration between a number of the university departments. I said in another talk that this was kind of like a research institute that we've created. And the colleague of mine that actually runs the research institute, Christian Herzog, said to me, "You make it sound so simple," and yet it really isn't. So in pulling together these companies and producing the Dimensions product as a collaboration in this type of environment, I think we have one of the few kind of corporate environments that could do this in an interesting way. Whilst at the same stage it continues, just like any collaboration, to be hard work to make that work. But as digital science, we try to not only reflect our community, but also think quite deeply about what the needs of the broader community are. And our community, as Janet said, obviously librarians are the most important people in the community. And then we have, under that, academics, and then institutions, funders, governments, and industries. So we have lots of different stakeholders, lots of different people who are themselves thinking deep thoughts about how their institutions need to move forward, but also very fundamentally about how research needs to move forward. And so actually understanding what we're trying to achieve, not only as digital science, but as a whole community, is really central to what we think about at digital science. And so we have a number of different kind of pieces of the puzzle that we're trying to put together. We think openness is a critical piece of the puzzle. Openness, though, can lead you down some blind alleys and some slightly tricky paths, and you have to contextualize that. It has to be as open as possible, but as closed as context demands. If you choose for everything to be open, then there are ethical issues with what you've done. If you choose for everything to be open in a commercial context, then perhaps you can't attract the funding or get the partners that you need. And so all of these things that we generally think of as being, these ideals that we set ourselves up to achieve have to be nuanced and have to be thought about carefully. Reproducibility is another really critical issue in research today. The fact that things are not reproducible, the fact I think it's something like 40% of economics output is not reproducible fundamentally, is something that we actually, as an entire industry and as a community, not just the economists on their own, need to deal with and think about. And so I'm very much thinking about that in terms of designing it into the types of approach that we design in our software. How can we design our software that supports researchers in a way that things are automatically reproducible? The way that we can actually change the culture so that people don't have to think about reproducibility. And this is actually one of the things that I'll come to a little bit later. It's a theme that will come back. I think contextualization of the things that we're doing, again, is incredibly important in today's world. So much is taken out of context for mostly for nefarious reasons. And I think that it's our responsibility, again, as a community, to ensure that the processes that we have in place, the people we're supporting, and the tools that we're giving them are in an excellent position to provide context. And so a lot of the motivation behind our Dimensions product was to increase the scope of context around the things people can see in research. Reproducibility, I said people shouldn't have to think about it. And I mean that in a very specific way. I think if we're thinking about how to move towards a kind of a research ecosystem 2.0, to use the much used terminology, it needs to be elegant. And I'm going to talk a little bit about elegance at the start of the talk. I think elegance is a really key thing to strive for in software, in organizational design, in all of the things that we're doing across our community. Things need to be elegant. And I think the big topic of the day almost is trust. There are so many things in the world at the moment that are eroding trust. And I think the most concerning of these is the erosion of trust in science and the erosion of trust in research. I would actually say over all my travels, in Australia, you probably have one of the healthiest communities and healthiest public discourses and debates around trust. A lot of countries, they don't have the trust that you have managed to maintain in this country with the relationship with the research community and with science. And so I think there's a lot to be learned from Australia, because I think you guys are doing quite a lot that's right. And so in giving parts of this talk elsewhere in the world, I often use Australia as a great example of a place that actually knows how to engage and how to invest in research in a way that other countries are failing to do. Trust, I think, is at the core of how I started thinking about how to build a research ecosystem. If you don't have a research ecosystem in place and you're building it afresh, you probably don't come up with what we've come up with. News articles like this, looking at ClimateGate and the level of distrust that created with the population in the UK, was, I think, certainly in my consciousness, a watershed moment where I thought, okay, there is something seriously going wrong here, because this is actually scientists doing their work correctly, keeping their records correctly, and things specifically being taken out of context in order to malign scientific work. And so actually deconstructing what happened at ClimateGate and what went wrong, I think, is a really important part of the evolution that we need to go through in designing the levels of data openness, the levels of sharing, the levels of collaboration that we'd all like to have in place. I thought this was a really fascinating article. This actually is an analysis showing that people who are now exposed to popular science programs actually value science less as a result of watching the popular science program. We have had a culture for many years of dumbing down science programs because we want them to be accessible. And what we've done actually in popular science communication is now make things so easy and understandable, and there's so little mystique actually when there is a significant body of stuff that we're not communicating, that people feel at the end of watching a science show that they understand everything and they no longer need researchers. So although I think science communicators do a fantastic job, and I think that they are absolutely critical members of our community, I think that we have gone too far down a slope of making everything bite-sized and everything consumable. And actually, we don't communicate the difficulty and the challenge of science. We merely communicate the sensationalism of science and the populism of science. We talk about the black hole coming through our solar system and destroying the Earth. We talk about the asteroid coming and hitting the Earth and destroying civilization. We talk about how all of the bugs, or something earlier this week, are dying off, and how we have a few years left and we're going to die shortly. You'll notice a common theme in that. It sells newspapers, it gets people's attention. We don't talk about all the cool things that we're doing which change science for the better, change our lives for the better. And again, I hope to come back to a couple of these topics as I go through what I'm talking about today. So this caught my eye about, it must be almost 18 months ago now. This appeared in The Atlantic. And you know that the end of science communication, scientific papers, is coming when actually it hits the mainstream press. I think most of us who are involved in publishing in any way, shape or form, either consuming periodicals, creating articles, creating periodicals, all of these different parts of the ecosystem, we've all known this has been coming for some time, but The Atlantic pointed it out in a really nice article, which actually looked quite a lot at some of the work that Stephen Wolfram had done at Mathematica, and how he had created an ecosystem which started to move towards a different type and different style of publication. But publications are really, really persistent. The journal article has a level of structure which is extremely beguiling to us as human beings. As part of the human condition, I still, even though I have my e-reader and my tablet, I still like to hold a book. I still like to have that tactile relationship with a piece of paper and what's written on it. And that's massively powerful in our psyche and how we think about communicating with other people. There's an incredibly elegant infrastructure that underpins the paper. If you look at this paper and you're anywhere close to an academic library, you will be able to tell me where the title of the journal is, where the title of the paper is, where the abstract is, where the list of authors and affiliations are, where the date is associated with this publication, where the main body of the text starts. You could probably give me a good guess as to where the DOI is, and those of you who are in certain fields may even recognize the journal itself. And I've shown you a white thing with several black boxes on it. That's incredibly powerful. In terms of how we think about communicating science, all of that, and research in general, all of that's built in. And so breaking your relationship with something this powerful is very difficult. Let's see how you did. Was everything where you thought it was? It probably was. So this is a completely disproportionately powerful mechanism for communicating research. And of course, it's been going on for a while. I mean, this is an industry which is now more than 350 years old, and we've been developing and effectively inculcating each generation of researchers with this elegant infrastructure and this approach to research communication. And up until fairly recently, this was actually a pretty good way of going about it. We didn't need too much more. But in the last 30 years, research's relationship with data has fundamentally shifted. And the kinds of outputs that we now have to share about our research, the kinds of stories we can tell, and the richness of the outputs has changed completely. We have videos, we have verbal recordings, we have massive data sets, we have visualizations of, as my colleague Mark Hannell likes to point out, spinny molecules. We have maps, we have data visualizations. And this is incredibly rich and doesn't fit inside our standardized framework of the paper. And in fact, this is perhaps a slightly more leading edge map of what's interesting to us. So yes, the publication is still powerful, it's still somewhat at the center of our mental map. But actually, we're interested in the reproducibility of that output. We're interested in the software that sat behind the result and that helped us do the analysis. We want to know about the data sets that sat behind it. We want to somehow quantify the impact of these results. We want to see how technology has been transferred from that result into another area. We want to understand if a PhD was trained as a result of the work. We want to understand whether policy has developed as a result. We want to know how it was funded, whether there are key affiliations either within the university sector or in industry that help to create this work. So there are many, many different pieces of the puzzle that we're starting to see in a rich data universe that underpins this single piece of paper that we are familiar with dealing with. In Dimensions, we tried the first step of actually looking one step beyond the paper. I think increasingly as we go forward, the types of tool we need are tools that bring context to what we're looking at. In Dimensions, we've tried a very simple experiment effectively in bringing together information around publications, together with information around grants, policy documents, clinical trials and patents, so that in one place you can start seeing a paper and you see the citations that are made from a patent to a paper. So that graph that I just showed you, actually starting to embody this and give context to a piece of research in a set of search results. I think this is the very beginning of a long journey where we stop thinking about searching for publications, when we think about searching for research outputs, and we start thinking about actually searching for propositions within research. We start thinking about the data sets that underlie the research. The data sets, typically speaking, most researchers are now starting to understand and realize that the data set under the research is much more valuable than the paper. The data set underlying the research is going to be responsible for many outputs, many different thoughts, many novel ideas, whereas the paper itself is perhaps just one perspective on that data set. And yet, within our system of incentivization for researchers, we effectively downplay data sets, and we push up papers. You get your postdoc for publishing in Nature or Cell. You don't get your postdoc, or indeed your professorial position, for the fantastic data set that you've created, which has spun off 1,500 papers. And that's a really interesting shift that we need to think about. I was giving some of these comments at the University of Melbourne a couple of weeks ago, and someone came up to me after my talk and said to me, we have actually made a professor for someone who actually did create a data set. He said, unfortunately, the professor concerned actually had all the Nature papers and everything else as well, so we can't actually say that we made him a professor for that. I'm saying, well, we need to change the culture. There are big issues around how this stuff is conceptualized and how it's put together. If you also think about how publication works in the world today, it's also massively back-weighted. Everything that publishers do for us is effectively in the final quarter of this circle. And indeed, this is a disproportionately generous normalization of the circle. I've tried to come up with something which is more subject-independent than normal. So I've talked about having an idea, trying to work out what data collection you do, whether that be surveying people in a social science experiment, collecting interviews with people. You're going to do some kind of data collection. You're going to apply for funding, carry out the data collection once you have the money to do it. You're then going to iterate and make sure that the data are correct. You're going to analyze the data, interpret them, and then right at the end, you're going to write it up, submit, have it reviewed and published. So we have this highly complex bit at the end, but what we've neglected to do in the research process is actually backfit a lot of things that we could be thinking about all the way back into that process. So if you think about things like ORCIDs, if you think about things like DOIs, unique identifiers, those all happen just before the publication happens. There's no opportunity for me to log into my piece of equipment or put my ORCID into my camera when I'm interviewing the subject. There's no ability to track all of the details around the context of those interviews or around the context of the spectrographic piece of equipment in the lab, taking the results and making them available. And actually, if we want to make things truly reproducible, we need to stop focusing on that tiny bit at the end just before publication. I think much more broadly about how research is done and how we can provide support to researchers across that whole time frame so that we're able to help them move forward in a reproducible way. The other message here is that the publication date is disproportionately powerful in our world. It was one of the lesser pieces of metadata that you thought about on that original slide that I showed you with the elegant infrastructure of the paper. But if you think about it, the version of record, the publication date, is in essence the thing that forces us into conceptualizing a paper as an object that you can hold in your hand. That's actually a thing that encumbers us in ways that we don't even really think about. If we stop thinking about a publication appearing on a certain date at a certain time, we would stop thinking about publications as having to be these PDF documents or these physical documents. And that tie-in to date is actually almost unseen, but incredibly pervasive in our experience of communicating research. So another set of problems around publication, how people pay for things. A lot of people think at the moment about how to get away from the subscription model. The subscription model is generally reviled, people hate it, they don't want the big deal anymore, they don't like paying for content on subscription on a regular basis. However, what the subscription model does for us, again, which we unwittingly overlook, is that it allows researchers to publish where they want to publish. They know that if they come up with a big result, and yet they are unfunded or their funder is unwilling to pay APCs, they can go to any journal and they can publish that content without having to pay to publish. And that's actually tremendously valuable for academic freedom, academic choice. Imagine for a moment that we lived in a world where, God forbid, universities should have research strategies. Imagine that we lived in a world where governments decided that they wanted to monitor how much came out of each university. I mean, it would be horrific, right? We'd have to do all sorts of data collection exercises. We'd have to return the data to the government. They'd have to do a review. I mean, who wants to set up like that? I mean, no sane country would clearly do that. But regardless, I understand that some countries do that. And in such a world, you can imagine that funders may have an interest in making things more open access because that's ultimately good for the taxpayer. They should see the outputs of the things that they've paid for. But if you're a young researcher and you're not funded, and your research doesn't happen to be well aligned with your university's research strategy, what is the impetus for the university to fund your publication in a journal with an APC? So if the world changes to a world in which there are no subscription journals, then the price we pay may indeed be a reduction in the overall cost, but it could be also a lessening of academic freedom, the ability to actually explore the things you want to explore, because effectively not being able to publish during the early part of your career because you can't afford to publish during the early part of your career may mean you have a very short career. So the APC model is not a panacea. I'm not speaking out against open access. I think open access is a complete ideal. It is something that we should be looking to do. I'm pointing out the fact that we haven't actually explored significant other business models, and we haven't looked at different ways of fixing what is essentially a broken system. It doesn't mean that the one business model that we're backing is necessarily the business model to look at. Luckily, there are a couple of companies who are playing with different business models. And Faculty of 1,000, Figshare, they are reconceptualizing the space effectively in the context of thinking about infrastructure as a business model. So everybody pays a small amount to a communal infrastructure, which is then kept at low cost, which allows everybody to publish. If you then want to do some kind of peer review mechanism on top of that platform, there are multiple different business models that it can exist, which can be highly competitive on top of a low-cost infrastructure. In the case that you can't afford to have something peer-reviewed, you can still publish, and effectively your affiliation with your university is something of a peer review credential, albeit a very light one. So that there are models to actually be unpicked here. Again, I'm not going to go into this in terrible detail today, but there's more to be thought about in this space. Just blindly going forward with APCs, I think, is not necessarily the answer to the problems that we have with the subscription model. So I've spent a lot of time kind of lining up the problems, and now I want to go into a little bit about how you can think about certain types of solution. So I called the talk Reproduced, Atomized and Deconstructed. So you can see we finally got to the reproduced section about halfway through. So The rest of the talk is going to be condensed. You're going to get quite a lot of thoughts in quite a short period of time. Of course, the idea of reproduction is really about trying to get things to as close to a cookie-cutter approach, as you can see here, as possible. The idea being really that research should be produced in a way that allows others to take the results with some confidence and be able to rerun the experiment. This already works in some areas pretty well. As a physicist, I couldn't understand when someone told me that there was a reproducibility crisis. My first reaction to that was, well, the universe tends to work the same way over and over again. Surely you just do the experiment again and it comes out again. And indeed, in physics, we don't have a massive issue with reproducibility. But biology, of course, the pseudoscience that some people are involved in, is very, very difficult to reproduce things. It's really a challenge. The world does not work the same way. We as physicists have it easy. The universe is very consistent at the level that we deal with it. Biological organisms are extremely difficult to prepare in a way that they act the same way twice. And so reproducibility is a massive issue for these types of disciplines, and it's one of the reasons I didn't want to go into biology. It's far too messy. If you look at other disciplines, though, like economics, economics should be reproducible. But again, you're dealing with highly complex systems where actually setting up the initial conditions, they can run again and again, is incredibly challenging. And so we have areas which we think of as very, kind of beautiful marble-like subjects, which are highly theoretical, but they aren't. The subjects that they're dealing with are humans, they are biological systems, they're highly complex. And so reproduction is not something that we've been yet able to build in. But interestingly, we all carry these objects around with us. And these objects are tremendously nuanced in keeping track of many of the things that we do. And people have thought, for marketing purposes, deeply about how to make these objects trackable in time and space, and to know what you're thinking from one moment to the next. But we haven't applied this logic to our lab equipment. If I take a picture with my iPhone, I can tell you about where that picture was taken, what time of day, what date, the aperture size on the camera. I can tell you about 100 things associated with this device that took that picture. If you took that to the next level, this phone is probably already capturing things about that picture which it isn't telling me in this app for me to find out what metadata it holds. If it were really clever, and the iPhone is pretty clever, it could be measuring the local gravitational field strength. It could be looking at the magnetic field density in the area that I'm standing at the moment. It could be working out how many people are in proximity to the phone. There are many things this piece of equipment could be doing that aren't in the metadata available to this app. And again, we're not thinking about doing this with our lab equipment, and we really should be. If a piece of equipment sits in a lab and it's taking spectroscopic information for a chemistry experiment, it should know the gravitational field strength in the vicinity of that experiment. It should know the pressure of the air in the room where the experiment is being done. All of these background environmental things that go along with the photograph of the experiment should be being captured. So there's a massive opportunity for equipment suppliers, for people who actually care about research, to start fitting pieces of equipment which make them more contextually aware and making those data streams available to researchers to increase the possibility that we can make those experiments reproducible. So in terms of thinking about how scientific research needs to move forward in terms of reproducibility, I think there are a number of layers that one needs to build, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. So here's an open access journal, and right now you experience that as a online PDF, or you experience it as a piece of paper that you're holding in your hand, and that picture that you see of the bird flapping its wings is effectively flat to you. And any of you who have an iPhone or have worked with a system like Tableau or a reporting system, surely when you see a picture like that, your first inclination is that you want to double click on it. You want to see what's underneath it. That's becoming our intuition. That's something that we actually start to think about as part of our experience in the world. You want to do this to it, and then you want to do that to it. And so the systems that we need to build need to play off our intuitions. They actually need to leverage the things that we're learning in our everyday lives and make our experience of exploring literature like that. So in this case, this is an open access journal. They use Figshare, and actually you can kind of double click on that picture and you can get to the data set that's underneath. But actually that's only part of the picture. As I've already told you, we don't have any of the contextual information around that by default. We don't have any of the unique identifiers. No one logged into the piece of equipment with their ORCID. We didn't know the grid identifier of the institution where the piece of equipment existed. We don't know the serial number of the piece of equipment. All of that could be retrofitted into this data set as of today. So this is actually not a difficult problem to solve, in fact. But then I want to take this layer and I want to create a research atom out of it. I want to deconstruct the research into its constituent parts, and I want to make something which translates and which can be contextualized in different ways. So here's an example. Here's a map of the world. And what I've done here is I have used dimensions to pull out a list of my publications and the people who have cited my publications. I have then found the grid identifiers of the institutions where people have existed who've cited me, and I have then placed a little dot associated with the number of times that institution has cited me on the map. You'll notice there's nothing in Australia. Underneath that piece of work is a piece of code which did the analysis and showed you step by step what I did to the data. There's also a copy of the data that I took, that's the snapshot I took at the time that I produced that picture. So I'm starting to get the kind of data production layer that sits underneath the presentation layer. So we can start thinking of that in terms of a layered approach to a research object. And what I'm going to argue is that at the foundation of research, what we really have are research objects. And that those are the building blocks on which we want to build the future, not publications at all. So I have my presentation layer, and I have underneath that my data analysis and data caching layer. And then beneath that, I want to capture the experimental design, the thoughts that I had for how the experiment should be put together, how the data collection should work. Regardless what area I'm in, there'll be some sort of thought process that went into how this was going to be tested. And so I have a kind of a data production layer or a conceptual layer. And then beneath that, I want to have another layer. I want to have a layer that thinks about the ethics of what I'm doing. A layer that tells me that actually what I'm doing is well conceived, and I did think about the humans that I was going to interview or the lab rats that I was going to experiment upon. So this needs a framework of its own, which then underlays those other data layers. So I have my kind of conceptualization layer. And I think there are probably many more layers that I could add into this, but these are the key ones, and it gives you the idea about how I'm thinking about the space. In the new world, as I said to you earlier, I don't want to think about searching for publications. Rather, I want to be able to think about searching within these objects and also outside these objects to work out which objects might be relevant to me. And so in deconstructing this, I want to think about how I then take these atoms of research output and reconstruct them into something that I could then think about interacting with as a researcher. So my argument to you is that a paper is really simply a narrative linking a number of research objects. The paper is tastefully the kind of blue swishy thing in the middle, and the research objects that I'm pulling together are the bubbles. So effectively, I start my paper and I refer to a number of different bubbles that have existed in the past. I explain the relationship of my research to those bubbles. And then I talk about the bubbles that I've created in my research project and my interpretation of those bubbles. And then I might finish off by talking about new bubbles that could be created. And so, in essence, most of the work that we do today in research publication, you can boil a paper down to just a few statements of new ideas and new facts that are being created, and most of what's being created is context for the research bubbles that you've spent all of your money and time and effort creating. And put in these terms, I think it sounds rather silly that we promote people for the blue swishy bit in the middle when all the money is invested in the bubbles that go along the blue swishy bit. But being a theoretical physicist, I like to be highly reductionist about everything, and actually I think there's a way to turn the blue swishy bit into a bubble. And so this is a lot of what digital science thinks about, is how to deconstruct the narrative of papers and how we can enrich that and do interesting things with it so that we can start making this look more like a bubble. Because bubbles have all sorts of really nice properties in terms of searchability, understandability, reproducibility, reusability. And actually it would be really nice if we could do that with narrative in the same way or in a parallel way that we could do with research objects themselves. And so this slide starts to try and pull it all together. If you think about the kind of companies that I work with and the thoughts that we think, trying to pull it back now to kind of near today, I'm thinking about how you version a paper, how I could use a technology like Overleaf to help us version a paper in a way that there is no longer a version of record. Rather, there is a continuous evolution of a paper on which the co-authorship changes with time, in which the objects related to it and that are commented on change with time, and where we can break down that narrative into objects that we can check, we can make reproducible, and we can build into this and increase the world of it by building peer review into the object that we're creating as well. So peer review, I believe, should be a part of the research output. The equations in the paper, we should be able to relate to other equations that are known. The chemical compounds that are in the paper, we should be able to map to databases of chemical compounds. The antibodies in the paper, the same. There are many objects that we can use unique identifiers for and where we can map to the other types of objects that we know about. Versioning becomes really interesting in this world. And this is where we start moving much closer to a paradigm of, say, software development, actually for scientific production and research production for many areas, but I accept not all areas this model would work in. There's more work to be done to think that through. If you consider now you have your world where research objects are at the center, and some visualization, some perception filter of that object is included in a paper with some narrative around it. But the research object becomes updated with new data, and that changes the graphic in the paper. Then we need to start thinking about mechanisms that flag to us and say, the output here is actually out of sync with the narrative. Someone needs to reinterpret this. And so you can start thinking in terms of compiling your paper in the way that you compile a computer program to check it for errors and to see, in fact, whether all the parts of the paper are in sync with where they should be. This also technically probably means that we publish less. We publish more research objects, but actually narratives and approaches that we traditionally think of as papers become things that actually endure longer and have a longer lifespan. This is where I was talking about the change of authorship on the paper. You could imagine that different propositions in the paper, different objects in the paper, actually end up with different co-authors over periods of time. It may be that you've authored version 1, I've authored version 1.1, another colleague in the audience has nuanced 1.1 and spotted an error that I made, and a piece of code has changed as a result of that and created version 2 of our object. This is actually how research works, but we don't represent that very honestly or very faithfully in the communication mechanisms that we have. And so I think that evolution of the communication mechanism is really tied up with, starting today, how we think about how these objects are produced and the structures that we put behind them. So I think overall what I'm saying to you is I think that this is not a change that will happen quickly. There is a large culture change that needs to take place to make this work. What we will see is probably over the next 10 to 15 years, people starting to move more towards data objects and less towards narrative in terms of how they engage with each other. People will swap objects, they won't swap papers. People will try to explain objects in a self-contained way rather than writing a paper to contain the object. So when you see data journals coming up where you have a kind of data article, this is the first step in that direction. We're already starting to see people trying to feel their way around how objects should be communicated between researchers in the future. In some sense, this is my vision for the future of research publication. It is a sea of bubbles. In this sea of bubbles, you can imagine that artificial intelligence, being a popular topic today, might play a significant role. As I get on my train in the morning going up to my office, I might ask my artificial intelligence on my phone to please think about how these 4 data objects that I've noticed could be related, and to write me a background on those objects in an automated way so that by the time I get to the office, I have a short review article written by a computer on my desk explaining the background and context of these different objects. Then allowing me to spend the rest of my time thinking about how I might create a new object, how I might move an object forward. In the future, the AI may even make suggestions to me for obvious things that it thinks I might be able to do. I don't think AI, this is a personal view, I don't think AI will ever get to the level where it will be able to make that intellectual leap to tell you what the new discovery should be. But I do think that they are capable of drawing together more information than we can process in simple ways. And so I think that AI definitely has a role to play in helping improve the context of the things that we understand and the things that we look at. Of course, this itself is an approach that's fraught with problems. AI have inherent biases built into them, and with some of the learning that's going on in deep learning now, we don't even understand what those biases may be because we can't look inside the black box to understand how the data is interacting with itself in order to come out with certain solutions. So there's a lot of work to be done on testing this kind of approach, but I've already seen technologies on my travels that actually start to do things like this in very interesting ways. At the end of last year, we run a Catalyst program at Digital Science, which gives grants to new software entrepreneurs. And there's a product that just came out of Japan called Paper Digest, which actually starts to do the very first iterations of this type of thought process. It's a fascinating technology, very young team, and they're doing great work. So I guess the message that I wanted to leave you with is really, if you think about research publication and you think about scholarly publication as it is today, the world that we're looking at in the future is one where there is no publication. There is something at a deeper level that's going to be happening, and we're going to be focusing around the little green numbers that drop to the bottom of the screen. We're going to actually understand the data in a much more different way. But I think what will emerge is an elegant infrastructure on top of that, which allows us to query things in much more different and dynamic ways and pull together different assets that we have available to us than we currently have available to actually pull together today. And so that's really where I wanted to leave it. And thank you for listening. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. Tony.
Hi, Daniel. Tony Bouquet from Springer Nature here. So I have two suggestions on why the paper is so resilient. The first one is, of course, the idea of preeminence. Everything from Nobel Prizes to tenure, whatever, is determined whether you were the first. And the whole idea that you were the first to pass peer review, you were first to have a complete story, the suggestion that you understood everything when you wrote the paper is incredibly strong. And so the idea that a paper is a living object which is versioning destroys that idea, and of course suggests the real world, which is collaborative, and that you stand on the shoulders of giants. But I think that's one thing which we have to get over. I'm interested on your view on how we might give appropriate credit in that sort of world. And the other one is that human beings love narratives. We love to be told a story rather than look at a whole pile of data. This is why a newspaper will often use an AI to write an article about a sports event that is purely based on the data, because as human beings, we don't like to look at a list of numbers. We want to hear the story. So interested in your view on how we get away from these parts of human nature.
Sure, I think you're absolutely right about both points. For me, I think it's interesting. I would say that you said that a person got the Nobel Prize, as it were, for having the whole story. And I think that's an interesting observation. And certainly one I'd have to think more about unpicking. But the other substantive point is doing it first. And I actually think that in a world where you have a free open infrastructure or a low-cost open infrastructure that allows people to lodge a concept or a proposition in a public or semi-public way, actually potentially gives us a better route to showing priority. So if you think about baby steps, if you think about how archive works for the physicists, if you put something on archive first and you make it openly available, you are considered to have priority, even if it hasn't gone through peer review. And actually, people have caught a cold with this, because some people are very jumpy about posting on archive. They keep the result to themselves, they put it to the journal in a confidential way. Someone else working in a similar field comes up, posts it on archive. The guy who puts it on archive has priority. And this actually leads to very difficult conversations. So I think trying to move the culture to a culture where people put things on archive or an equivalent type of infrastructure is actually healthy, because it encourages people to be courageous and to actually share their idea early. If you get credit for having the idea early rather than finishing the idea and shutting everyone else out, then this is something good. And it's fascinating. I made this comment in Melbourne, and Janet was smiling because you used the phrase "on the shoulders of giants." There's a story behind that phrase. So Newton used the phrase "standing on the shoulders of giants" because he wanted to be disparaging about a gentleman called Hooke, who was president of the Royal Society. No relation to mine. I don't believe so. And Hooke had beleaguered Newton for decades. They really hated each other. Hooke would go over Newton's papers and find tiny errors and then slate him about it in public. It was horrific. And Newton made that comment specifically because Hooke was a short man, and he specifically wanted to say, "on the shoulders of giants, not you." But the amusing thing, the relevant thing here, is that Newton was also not beyond being somewhat petty. And Optics, his second great volume after the Principia, didn't appear in print until 1 year after Hooke died, specifically because Newton did not want to share the results with Hooke. So Newton waited 30 years to publish Optics. And I would suggest that that's not a culture that we want to incentivize. So a few thoughts.
I think we'll have to leave it there. I hope, just like the question, that it starts some debate, because we tend to go down the APC path without thinking about different futures. So I think it's worth us having lots of discussions about what is the future of scholarly communications, and do we know the answers. So please put your hands together and thank Daniel. Thank you. There's a